The morning I moved my savings, the house was completely quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet you notice on a good day. The heavier kind. The kind that settles into the walls when you have lived in the same place for decades and suddenly realize something in your life does not belong to you anymore. I was standing at my kitchen counter, holding a mug of coffee that had already gone cold. The clock above the stove read 7:18 a.m. Sunlight came through the window just enough to light the table where my husband used to sit every morning before he passed away 2 years ago. That morning felt ordinary. But it was not. Because 30 minutes later, I would drive to the credit union where I had kept my savings for more than 40 years, and I would make one quiet decision that would change everything in my family. My name is Marabel Rowan. I am 63 years old. I worked most of my life in a small accounting office downtown. I raised one daughter. I paid my bills on time. I saved carefully. And until recently, I believed something very simple about my life. I believed my money was still mine. That belief began to crack slowly after my husband died. At first it was small things. My daughter Alyssa started coming by more often. She said she was worried about me being alone. She offered to help with the paperwork, the bills, the online accounts. At the time, it sounded like love. "Mom, let me handle it," she would say, sitting at my kitchen table with my laptop open in front of her. "You should not have to worry about these things anymore." And for a while, I believed that too. But over the months, something strange started happening. My bank statements stopped arriving in the mail. My debit card sometimes disappeared from the place I always kept it. When I asked about balances or payments, Alyssa would smile and say the same reassuring sentence. "Everything's fine, Mom." The problem with the word fine is that it is not a number. And I spent my entire life working with numbers. The moment that changed everything came one afternoon when I noticed a charge on my account that I did not recognize. When I asked Alyssa about it, she sighed the way people do when they think. They're explaining something obvious to a child. "Mom," she said gently, "you probably just forgot." Forgot. That word stayed with me. Not because I believed it, but because I realized something far worse. If someone says you are confused long enough, eventually everyone around you starts believing it, including you. For weeks I told myself I was overthinking things. I told myself my daughter was only trying to help. I told myself families go through difficult adjustments after loss. But one quiet morning, standing in that same kitchen with my coffee going cold in my hand, I understood something that made my stomach tighten. I was starting to feel like a guest in my own life. So I grabbed my purse, got in my car, and drove to the credit union. I did not call Alyssa. I did not ask permission. I simply walked up to the counter and told the teller something I had never said in 40 years of banking there. "I need to open a new account," I said. "In my name only." Less than an hour later, every dollar I had saved over a lifetime had been transferred into that account. And for the first time in months, I felt something close to relief. What I did not know yet was that someone had been watching that money very closely. Because 3 hours later, my phone started ringing. And before the afternoon was over, my daughter would be standing on my porch, screaming like I had just stolen something that belonged to her. Alyssa did not move into my life all at once. If she had, I might have noticed sooner. Instead, it happened the way most changes in families happen, quietly, in pieces small enough that they did not feel worth arguing about. The first few weeks after my husband passed were a blur of paperwork and silence. People came by with casseroles, neighbors stopped at the door to ask if I needed anything, and the house felt far too big for one person. Alyssa started visiting more often during that time. At first it was comforting. She would bring groceries, straighten up the living room, and sit with me at the kitchen table the way she used to when she was younger. Sometimes she would stay late just talking, telling stories about work or complaining about traffic. One afternoon she arrived carrying her laptop and a folder full of envelopes. "You should not have to deal with all this right now," she said gently, spreading the bills across the table. "Let me help you organize everything." I remember feeling grateful. Grief does strange things to your energy. Even simple tasks can feel heavier than they should. Letting her take over a few small things felt like a relief. So I let her. She set up online payments for the electricity and water. She showed me how to check my accounts on the computer instead of waiting for statements in the mail. Mom, it is faster this way, she said. Everyone does it now. I laughed a little at that. Not everyone, I told her. But she smiled and waved it off. Trust me, she said. It will make things easier. And for a while, it did. The next change came a few weeks later. We were eating dinner when she asked a question that seemed harmless at the time. How much do you usually keep in your checking account? I shrugged. Enough. She smiled patiently. That is not really an answer. So I gave her a number. She nodded slowly, like she was storing the information away for later. At the time, I thought she was simply trying to understand my finances so she could help keep things organized. I did not realize that conversation would become the beginning of a pattern. Over the next month, Alyssa started asking more questions. About my savings. About the mortgage that had already been paid off years ago. About how much I spent on groceries and prescriptions each month. None of the questions sounded aggressive. They were always wrapped in concern. I just want to make sure you are secure, she would say. And security sounded like a good thing. But something else began changing too. My mail stopped landing on the kitchen table unopened. Alyssa started sorting it first. If I reached for an envelope from the credit union, she would glance at it and say casually, "Oh, that is nothing important. I already handled it." Sometimes she would open letters before I even saw them. At first I assumed she was just trying to help. But after a while, I noticed something strange. I was seeing fewer and fewer details about my own accounts. Whenever I asked about balances, Alyssa would give me summaries instead of numbers. "You're fine, Mom," she would say. "You have plenty saved." Plenty. That word started appearing everywhere. Plenty sounded reassuring. But it also sounded vague. And vague answers have a way of making people stop asking questions. The first time I noticed my debit card missing, I thought I had simply misplaced it. I checked the usual drawer near the refrigerator where I always kept my wallet. It was not there. A few minutes later, Alyssa walked into the kitchen holding it. "You left it in the living room," she said quickly. "I put it in my purse so it would not get lost." I laughed it off. "Good thing you found it," I said. She smiled. "See? That is exactly why I help with these things." At the time, her words sounded practical. But looking back now, I realized that was the moment something subtle shifted. Because slowly, almost without noticing, I had started asking my daughter about my own money, instead of simply knowing. The strange thing about losing control is that it rarely feels like losing control at the beginning. Most of the time, it feels like convenience. After Alyssa started helping with the bills and the mail, life actually seemed simpler for a while. I did not have to remember payment dates. I did not have to sort through envelopes or log into accounts that asked for passwords I never quite remembered. Whenever I asked about something, Alyssa already had the answer. "It's taken care of," she would say. And I wanted to believe her. But over the next few months, something subtle began to change in the way we talked about money. At first, she asked questions. Then she started making decisions. It happened so gradually that I did not notice it right away. One afternoon, I mentioned that I might buy a new winter coat. The one I had been wearing for years had started to thin at the elbows, and the lining was coming loose near the zipper. It was not an expensive coat, just something warm. But Alyssa looked up from her phone and shook her head. "You do not really need one," she said. I laughed, thinking she was joking. "I think I do," I said. "Winter is not getting any warmer." She did not laugh back. "You barely go anywhere," she said calmly. "It would be smarter to save the money." Save the money. The sentence sat strangely in the air between us. Because the money we were talking about was mine. I had earned it. I had saved it. And until that moment, I had never heard anyone suggest I needed permission to spend it. Still, I did not argue. Family conversations can become tense very quickly, and I had no interest in turning a simple comment about a coat into a disagreement. So I dropped the subject. But after that day, I started noticing something else. The word "we" began appearing in Alyssa's sentences. We should be careful with spending. We have to think long term. We need to keep things stable. The word sounded harmless. But every time she used it, something inside me tightened. Because for most of my life, financial decisions in this house had always been made by two people. My husband and me. After he passed away, Those decisions had become mine alone. And yet somehow, without any clear moment of agreement, the word we had replaced I. The next time I asked about my savings balance, Alyssa did not give me a number. She leaned back in her chair and folded her arms. "Mom," she said patiently, "you worry too much about details." "I'm not worried," I said. "I just like to keep track." She gave me the same gentle smile she used when explaining technology to me. "You don't need to track everything," she said. "That's why I'm helping." Helping. There was that word again. It sounded generous, responsible, loving. But the more often I heard it, the more it began to feel like a door closing quietly somewhere behind me. Because each time Alyssa said she was helping, there was something I no longer had access to. A password. A statement. A balance. And little by little, asking about those things began to feel uncomfortable. Not because I believed I was doing something wrong, but because every time I asked a question, Alyssa reacted the same way. She sighed softly. Or she tilted her head. Or she said something that made the conversation feel awkward. "Mom, you trust me, right?" That question is a powerful one. Because if you say yes, the conversation ends. And if you hesitate, suddenly you are the one creating a problem. So every time she asked it, I answered the same way. Yes. But after enough conversations like that, something changed inside me. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just quietly enough that I almost ignored it. I started noticing that I was choosing my words more carefully when talking about money. I stopped asking certain questions altogether. And one evening, while standing in my own kitchen with my checkbook in my hand, I felt something I had never expected to feel in my own home. Embarrassment. Not because I had done anything wrong, but because I suddenly realized something unsettling. I no longer felt comfortable asking about the money I had spent my entire life earning. The moment that truly unsettled me did not arrive with an argument. There were no raised voices. No accusations. Just a small detail that refused to sit quietly in my mind. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. I had been sorting through a drawer in the hallway where I kept things I rarely needed but never threw away: old warranties, a few birthday cards from years ago, and a small notebook where I used to jot down reminders about bills. I had not used that notebook in months. Alyssa had told me it was unnecessary now that everything was automated. Still, I flipped through it out of habit. That was when I noticed something strange. A charge from the pharmacy written beside a date from the previous week. The number was larger than usual. Not dramatically large, but enough that it caught my attention. For years I had picked up the same prescriptions at the same place. The amounts rarely changed. So I went to the kitchen where Alyssa was sitting with her laptop open. "Alyssa," I said casually, "did we have a bigger pharmacy bill last week?" She looked up immediately. Too quickly. "Oh, that," she said. "That was household stuff." "Household stuff." I repeated. "Yeah," she said, already looking back at the screen. "Cleaning supplies and a few other things." I waited a moment. The answer felt incomplete. "What cleaning supplies?" I asked. This time she sighed. Not loudly. Just enough to make the question feel inconvenient. "Mom," she said, "you probably just don't remember. I picked up a few things when I was already there." Her tone was light. Almost cheerful. But the sentence stayed in the air longer than it should have. "You probably just don't remember." I stood there for a moment, feeling a slow warmth rise into my face. Not because I was confused, but because the explanation placed me in a position that felt strangely uncomfortable. If I disagreed with her, I would sound defensive. If I insisted on details, it would sound like I was accusing her of something. And if I simply accepted the answer, the conversation would end. So I nodded. "All right," I said quietly. But something about the exchange stayed with me. Later that evening, after Alyssa had gone home, I sat at the kitchen table and tried to remember exactly what I had purchased at the pharmacy that week. I could not think of anything unusual. The more I tried to recall it, the more unsettled I felt. Not because of the money itself. It was not a large amount. But because of the way the conversation had unfolded. The next morning I noticed something else. My checkbook was not where I usually kept it. It had always sat in the small wooden tray beside the refrigerator. Now it was sitting on the counter near Alyssa's bag. I picked it up and flipped through the pages. Nothing looked obviously wrong, but the fact that it had been moved at all bothered me more than I expected. When Alyssa came into the kitchen, I mentioned it. "Did you move my checkbook?" She barely glanced at it. "Oh," she said, "yeah. I was organizing a few things yesterday." "Why?" "So you wouldn't lose it." The answer came quickly, smoothly. Too smoothly. I looked at her for a moment. "I've kept it in the same place for 20 years, I said. She laughed softly. "Exactly," she said. "And sometimes you forget where you put things." Again. That word. Forget. By itself, it sounded harmless. But hearing it twice in the same week made something inside me tighten. Because slowly, without ever saying it directly, Alyssa was creating a quiet explanation for every question I asked. If I noticed something unusual, I had probably forgotten. If I asked about a charge, I must have misunderstood. If something was missing, I must have misplaced it. The pattern was subtle, but once I saw it, I could not unsee it. And that was the moment a thought entered my mind for the first time. A thought I did not want to believe. What if the problem was not my memory at all? What if the problem was that someone else had started making decisions about my life without ever asking me? Once you begin noticing a pattern, it becomes impossible to stop seeing it. For a long time, I had explained away the small things. A missing envelope. A vague answer. A sentence that suggested I had forgotten something I clearly remembered. Each moment by itself was easy to ignore. But when they started stacking on top of each other, something about my own life began to feel unfamiliar. The first thing that truly bothered me was the mail. For most of my adult life, opening the mailbox had been part of my daily routine. I would bring the envelopes inside, sit at the kitchen table, and sort them one by one. Bills, bank statements, advertisements, nothing particularly exciting, but it was part of how I stayed aware of my finances. After Alyssa started helping, that routine quietly disappeared. More and more often, she would arrive before I checked the mailbox. And more often, the mail was already opened by the time I saw it. "Oh, I took care of that," she would say casually, placing a stack of papers on the counter. At first, I thought she was just trying to save me time. But one morning I noticed something that made me pause. There was no bank statement in the stack. For years, the credit union had mailed one at the same time every month. It always arrived during the first week. That week came and went. Nothing arrived. At first, I assumed it was simply late. But after another few days passed, I mentioned it at breakfast. "Did you see the statement from the credit union this month?" I asked. Alyssa did not look up from her phone. "I switched it to paperless," she said. I blinked. "You what?" "It's safer," she replied calmly. "No one can steal your mail and get your information." I stared at her. "I didn't ask for that." She shrugged. "You probably would have forgotten your login anyway." Her tone was light, almost playful, like we were sharing a harmless joke. But I did not feel like laughing. For the first time, I realized something important had changed. Decisions about my money were being made without me. After that conversation, I tried to pay closer attention. But that turned out to be harder than I expected. Whenever I asked for specific numbers, balances, payments, details, Alyssa responded with the same reassuring summary. "You're fine. You've got plenty saved. Everything's covered." Covered. That word began to irritate me. Because covered did not tell me anything. One evening I decided to check my debit card before going to the grocery store. It was not in my wallet. I searched the kitchen counter, the small tray near the refrigerator, even the pockets of the coat I had worn the day before. Nothing. A few minutes later, Alyssa walked into the room and held it up between her fingers. "Looking for this?" she asked. I frowned. "Where did you find it?" "In your purse," she said quickly. "You keep misplacing things lately." I knew that was not true. But the confidence in her voice made me hesitate. "I don't remember putting it there," I said slowly. She gave me a sympathetic smile. "That's what I mean," she said gently. "You're forgetting little things." The words were soft, concerned, almost caring. But something about them landed heavily in my chest. Because in that moment, I realized how easily the story could be rewritten. If my daughter said often enough that I was confused, eventually everyone would believe it. even the bank, even our neighbors, maybe even me. And standing there in my own kitchen, holding my debit card like it was proof of something I could not quite explain, a realization settled quietly into my mind. I was still living in the same house. I was still paying the same bills. But somehow, without any clear moment when it happened, I had started disappearing from my own life. The decision did not arrive with a dramatic moment. No argument. No confrontation. No sudden discovery. It came quietly. So quietly that if someone had asked me the night before what I planned to do the next morning, I would not have had an answer. But something inside me had been shifting for weeks. Every time Alyssa said, "You probably forgot." Every time she answered a question about my money with a vague sentence. Every time I hesitated before asking something that used to belong entirely to me. All of those moments had been building toward something. And that morning, standing alone in my kitchen with the early sunlight coming through the window, I realized what it was. I was tired of feeling small in my own life. The house was quiet. The refrigerator hummed softly. A car drove past outside. Somewhere down the street a dog barked once and then stopped. Everything about the morning felt ordinary. Except the thought that would not leave my mind. What if I simply took control again? At first, the idea felt almost rebellious. Not because I was doing anything wrong, but because I had grown used to explaining my decisions, justifying them, running them past someone else first. Even though the money had always been mine. I poured a cup of coffee and sat at the table. For a long moment, I stared at the surface of the wood where my husband used to rest his newspaper every morning. For years, he and I had handled our finances together. He trusted me completely. That thought made something inside my chest tighten. Because somewhere along the way, I had stopped trusting myself. Or maybe more accurately, I had allowed someone else to decide when I should trust myself. The realization settled heavily, but it also brought something else with it. Clarity. I finished my coffee, rinsed the mug in the sink, and walked down the hallway to grab my purse. I did not call Alyssa. I did not leave a note. I simply got in my car and drove to the credit union. The same credit union I had been using since Alyssa was a baby. The building looked exactly the same as it always had. Same brick exterior. Same small row of windows. Same faded sign near the parking lot entrance. When I walked inside, the familiar smell of paper and polished floors greeted me. Carla was working at the counter that morning. She had been a teller there for as long as I could remember. Long enough that she knew my name before I even handed over my identification. "Good morning, Marabel," she said with a warm smile. "How are you today?" "Fine," I replied automatically. The word felt easier than explaining the complicated mix of emotions sitting quietly in my chest. Carla typed something into her computer and looked up again. "What can I help you with?" For a brief second, I hesitated. Not because I doubted the decision, but because saying it out loud made it real. "I need to open a new account," I said. Carla nodded politely. "Checking or savings?" "Both," I said after a moment. She paused slightly. "All right," she said. "Will anyone else need access to the account?" The question hung in the air longer than it should have. For months, the automatic answer would have been yes. But that morning something inside me felt different. "No," I said quietly. "In my name only." Carla glanced up briefly, studying my expression, then nodded without asking further questions. "Of course," she said. She began typing again, the soft clicking of the keyboard filling the space between us. When the paperwork was ready, she slid the forms across the counter. I signed where she pointed. My hand trembled slightly on the first line. But by the time I reached the last signature, it was steady. Then came the final question. "How much would you like to transfer into the new account?" I looked at the number displayed on the screen. Decades of careful saving. Years of work. Every bit of security I had built for myself. And for the first time in months, the answer felt simple. "All of it," I said. Carla nodded and processed the transfer. Within minutes, everything was done. When she handed me the receipt, she smiled gently. "You're all set," she said. "Only you have access." I thanked her and walked back out into the morning sunlight. For a moment, standing beside my car, I felt something unfamiliar. Not excitement. Not triumph. Just a quiet, steady relief. What I did not know yet was that someone else had been paying very close attention to that account. And by the time I got home, my phone had already started ringing. When I got home from the credit union, the house looked exactly the same as it had that morning. The same sunlight stretched across the kitchen floor. The same quiet filled the rooms. Nothing about the furniture or the walls suggested that anything had changed. And yet something had. I set my purse on the chair near the door and stood there for a moment, letting the silence settle around me. For the first time in months, my mind felt clear. Not lighter exactly, but steady. I filled the kettle with water and placed it on the stove, planning to make tea. The small, familiar routine felt comforting after the strange weight of the morning. Just as the water began to heat, my phone buzzed. On the counter. I glanced at the screen. Alyssa. For a moment I considered answering, but something inside me hesitated. Instead, I let the call ring until it stopped. The kettle clicked off a few seconds later. I poured the hot water over a tea bag and carried the mug to the kitchen table. Before I even sat down, the phone buzzed again. A second call. Then another. The sound echoed softly in the quiet house. I watched the screen light up again and again. Finally, on the third call, I picked it up. Hello. The voice on the other end did not greet me. Why didn't you tell me you went to the bank? Alyssa's tone was tight, stretched thin with something that sounded very close to panic. I leaned back slightly in my chair. I had errands, I said calmly. There was a pause. To the credit union? She asked sharply. Yes. Another pause. This one longer. You should have told me, she said. The sentence came out quickly, like it had been building for several minutes. I frowned slightly. I didn't realize I needed to. The silence on the other end changed. Not empty. Charged. Then Alyssa laughed. But it was not the kind of laugh that came from amusement. You don't just move money without saying something, she said. The words landed heavily in the room. I looked down at the steam rising from my tea. I moved my money, I said quietly. Her voice dropped immediately. That affects me. I closed my eyes for a moment. It shouldn't. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then the line went dead. No goodbye. Just silence. I placed the phone on the table and stared at it for a long moment. The tea had already begun to cool. I picked up the mug, took a sip, and realized it had gone almost completely cold. Without thinking, I stood up, carried it to the sink, and poured it out. Then I started another kettle. The small routine gave my hands something to do while my mind tried to process the conversation. Her words kept replaying in my head. That affects me. The sentence unsettled me more than the anger in her voice, because it suggested something I had not considered before. Not just that Alyssa had been involved in my finances, but that she had been relying on them. I poured the second cup of tea more slowly this time. Outside, a car passed down the street. A few minutes later, the quiet house settled again. For a while, nothing happened. No more calls. No messages. Just the low hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of the kitchen clock. I began to think the conversation might be over. Then, sometime after 3 in the afternoon, I heard the sound of tires stopping sharply at the curb. A car door slammed. Hard. I did not move right away. Instead, I stood at the kitchen counter with my hands resting lightly against the surface, listening. Footsteps moved quickly up the front walkway. Then came the knock. Not the polite kind. Not the hesitant kind neighbors use when they are unsure if someone is home. This knock was loud. Sharp. Demanding to be heard. Before the second round of pounding started, I walked to the door and opened it. Alyssa was already mid-sentence. Are you out of your mind? Her voice carried across the porch and into the street. Her face was flushed. Her hands were shaking. And the moment she saw me standing there, she stepped forward like she was claiming the space between us. You don't just do something like that, she shouted. You don't move money without telling me. For a moment, neither of us moved. Alyssa stood on the porch breathing hard, the anger in her voice still echoing down the quiet street. I could see the neighbor across the road slowing down while walking his dog, glancing toward the house. But Alyssa did not seem to notice. Or maybe she simply did not care. You don't move money like that, she said again, her voice still raised. You should have talked to me first. I stayed in the doorway. The afternoon sunlight fell across the porch between us, highlighting the tension in her shoulders. I moved my savings, I said calmly. That's all. That's all, she repeated sharply. She let out a short laugh that held no humor. Do you have any idea what you just did? I tilted my head slightly. I went to the bank. Don't play dumb, she snapped. I'm not. Her hands moved as she spoke, quick restless gestures that reminded me of how she used to argue as a teenager. I've been managing things, she said. I've been keeping everything organized for you. For me, I repeated quietly. Yes, for you, she said, her voice rising again. You get confused sometimes. You forget things. We talked about this. We talked about helping, I said. Not control. The word landed harder than I expected. Alyssa froze for a second, clearly caught off guard. Then she scoffed. Control? Seriously, she said. I'm the one making sure you don't mess things up. That money isn't yours, I said softly. Her eyes flashed. It affects my life. There it was. The sentence hung between us in the warm afternoon air. I looked at her carefully. That's the problem, I said. For a brief moment, Alyssa looked startled, as if she had not expected me to say the quiet part out loud. You're acting like I stole something, she said. I'm acting like I needed my name back on my accounts. Her mouth opened, then closed again. For the first time since she arrived, she seemed unsure of what to say next. You embarrassed me, she said finally. The words came out tight. I had plans. You had access, I replied. That's not the same thing. Her expression hardened. You're going to fix this, she said. The demand in her voice was unmistakable. No, I said. The word surprised both of us. It came out calm. Steady. Final. Alyssa stared at me like she had never seen me before. For years, I had avoided arguments. I had softened my tone, changed the subject, found ways to keep the peace. But standing there on that porch, something inside me felt different. Not angry. Just done. You're being irrational, she said after a moment, lowering her voice as if that would make her sound more reasonable. This isn't like you. I met her eyes. This is exactly like me, I said. You just haven't been listening. She began pacing across the porch. You don't understand the timing, she muttered. I had things set up. For what? I asked. She stopped suddenly. That's not the point. It is when you're shouting about my money. Her jaw tightened. I took responsibility when you couldn't. I didn't ask you to. You needed help, she insisted. I was grieving, I said quietly. Those aren't the same thing. The words seemed to hit her harder than the shouting had. For a moment, the anger in her face flickered into something else. Something closer to frustration. Or fear. You're rewriting everything, she said. No, I replied. I'm remembering it. Silence settled between us. The loud energy that had brought her here was starting to drain away. You don't see how hard this has been for me, she said, her voice softer now. I took a slow breath. I see exactly how hard it's been, I said. I just finally realized something. She waited. I looked at her and spoke the truth I had been swallowing for months. I started feeling afraid to ask about my own money. The words landed quietly, but they filled the entire porch. Alyssa blinked. That's not fair. It's true, I said. I stopped asking questions because every time I did, you told me I was confused. Her shoulders dropped slightly. You didn't have to move all of it, she said. Yes, I replied. I did. Her eyes searched my face one more time. Looking for hesitation. Looking for weakness. Looking for the version of me who would eventually give in. But she did not find it. Because something had already changed. And this time, I wasn't stepping back. For a long moment, neither of us said anything. The anger that had carried Alyssa to my porch was fading now, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than the shouting ever had. She stood there looking at me, as if she were trying to find the version of her mother she had expected to see. The one who apologized. The one who explained. The one who eventually gave in. But that woman was not standing in the doorway anymore. You really moved everything? She asked finally. Her voice was quieter now. Not calm exactly. Just uncertain. Yes, I said. All of it. Her shoulders dropped slightly, the tension in them loosening for the first time since she arrived. "That's not how we planned it," she muttered. I shook my head gently. "We didn't plan anything," I said. "You did." She swallowed, looking past me into the house for a moment as if she were measuring the distance between the life she thought she understood and the one standing in front of her now. "So I can't access it anymore?" she asked. No, the word came out simple. Clear. Final. She pressed her lips together and exhaled slowly through her nose. "You didn't have to do it like this," she said. "This was the only way I could do it," I replied. Another silence settled between us. But this one felt different. Not tense. Not explosive. Just empty in a way that suggested something had ended. Alyssa glanced toward the street, then back at me. When she spoke again, her voice sounded smaller than it had all afternoon. "I was counting on that money." I met her gaze. "I was counting on being safe." The sentence landed quietly between us. And this time, she did not argue. For a few seconds she simply stood there, staring at the porch floor as if the answer she wanted might be written somewhere between the wooden boards. Then she nodded once. Not agreement. Not acceptance. Just acknowledgement. "I need time," she said. "So do I replied. She turned and walked down the steps without another word. Her car door closed more gently this time. The engine started. And a few seconds later, she drove away. I stood there watching the empty street long after the sound of the car disappeared. The porch felt different once she was gone. Not lighter. Just steady. Like the house itself had finally taken a breath. That night, Alyssa didn't call. She didn't come back. The next morning, my phone buzzed once with a text message. "I need space." I looked at the screen for a moment. Then I typed back. "So do I." After that, I set the phone face down on the table and left it there. Life didn't suddenly become perfect after that day. Families rarely work that way. But something important had changed. I went back to the credit union later that week and confirmed the account details. Everything was exactly where it should be. Only my name. Only my access. Only my decisions. At home, I started doing something simple that I had not done in a long time. I began paying my own bills again. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to. Each envelope I opened felt strangely ordinary. And that was the point. Ordinary meant I had my life back. A few days later, Alyssa stopped by briefly to pick up a box she had left behind. She stood in the doorway, hesitant. "I'm not here to argue," she said. "Neither am I replied. She nodded slowly. "I didn't realize how far things had gone," she admitted. "I did," I said gently. "That's why I had to stop it." She didn't answer. She picked up the box, walked back to her car, and left without slamming the door. It wasn't reconciliation, but it was something closer to understanding. And sometimes, that is where healing begins. Because the truth I learned from all of this is simple. Love should never require silence. Help should never take away your voice. And boundaries are not punishments. They're how we protect the parts of ourselves that deserve to remain whole. The day I moved my savings, I didn't lose my daughter. I didn't destroy my family. What I did was something much quieter. I remembered who I was before I started asking permission to exist comfortably in my own life.